So welcome back for the fifth and final principle of American government. And the last one was separation of powers. Let's take a look at this idea of checks and balances. Now, oftentimes, when we talk about checks and balances, focus mostly on the checks, but I also like to take a look at the balances here because they are just as important in understanding kind of this division of power within American government. So what we see is we have our three branches of government. We've got the legislative, executive, judiciary. The legislature is divided up into the House and the Senate. Now, as we know, while the legislative branch is charged with basically, building legislation and sending laws to the president, and the president is, there to carry out the laws that are passed by the legislature, by Congress. Judiciary is there in an effort to be able to focus on judging on the constitutionality of actions of other branches of government and individuals within society. These three branches are not completely separated from each other. In other words, they interact with each other. And that kind of energy of interaction and checking each other was integral to the founders' understanding of making sure that no branch would have one more power than the other, right? So let's think about what might be a check on government. The president's biggest check, and what brings the president really in contact with Congress probably the most, is the threat of a veto. In other words, the president's ability to be able to say to Congress, I'm going to veto a piece of legislation that you're sending me, therefore you must negotiate with me. And generally, the majorities are not big enough to override a veto, so Congress kind of works with the president or doesn't work with the president, depending on the situation. But they know that the president has power over legislative capacity because they can veto legislation. Now, Congress also has the ability to be able to override a veto, right? So the president doesn't have an unqualified veto in which he says, nope, this isn't going to happen. Congress can vote, both houses vote to override the veto, then that piece of legislation becomes law. So it's a check there, right? We can also think in terms of the judiciary, right? And we talked about the concept of judicial review. And under the concept of judicial review, members of the judiciary have the ability to be able to judge actions of the executive branch and the legislative branch unconstitutional. So that's an enormous amount of power when you think about it. Here's an unelected body that can take a look at the action of a president or take a look at the action of Congress and say, what you've done stands between, is the Constitution is the highest law of the land. What you've done in your legislative capacity is to create something that violates the Constitution. Therefore, it is no longer an adequate piece of legislation, right? So that's one way. Now, we also have the judiciary basically being checked because, unlike anybody else here, they are not elected by the people directly. So the president has the ability to be able to nominate people to the judiciary, the federal judiciary, and then the Senate holds hearings to confirm those members through their advice and consent powers. So the judiciary, while you hold that position for life, in other words, you're trying to make these justices immune to public pressure and have them just focus on the Constitution, we have two branches of the federal government involved in picking them, the president and also the United States Senate. On top of that, we have, as we've seen twice in recent decades, have the power of Congress to be able to impeach and then potentially remove the president of the United States. So that's an enormous check on them, right? So the legislature, the impeachment process starts out in the House of Representatives, and the president can be impeached by the House on a number of different articles. If you're a criminal justice major, it's kind of like the equivalent of having a grand jury indict somebody. They're not saying necessarily the person's absolutely guilty, but they see that there's enough evidence for this to go to trial. Then it goes to the trial in the US Senate, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides over the hearing in the US Senate and then the Senate votes on whether or not to remove the president. So that's a, if you think about that, that's a really big power that the United States Congress has. They can remove members of, from the executive branch. They also have the ability to be able to do that with judges as well, if need be. So there are a lot of different ways then in which, we have checks between different areas of government. The president has the right to be able to make treaties with other countries, but then it's got to be passed by the Senate, and that can be rejected. So again, that's where we see these checks. Very important. Really, most actions by one area or one branch of government are somehow intertwined with the action of others. But what about this second concept here that we talk about less, which is the idea of balances? There are a number of balances that are built into the Constitution. So if you think about it, and you can tell I was not a geography major in undergrad, that is a map of the United States. I'm sure you can see that, right? So if you look at that, the president and the vice president are the only two people in the United States that are elected across the entire nation, right? So they have a certain perspective that is in the common good for the entire country, or at least, the states in the Electoral College that elected them, right? Now let's take Pennsylvania over here, and we have two senators. And those two senators are elected for 6-year terms here to represent the entire state of Pennsylvania. And we're a very diverse state, right? Pennsylvania very rarely ever picks really extreme conservatives or really extreme liberals, because we've got such a diversity of types of people in the state. The more conservative central part of Pennsylvania and northern tier, and then kind of the more democratic and progressive areas on what we call the coasts, which would be Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. So they represent the entire state and the interests of the entire state, which can be very difficult in a diverse state like Pennsylvania. Then on top of that, just go down here, and we can take a look at Chester, and we're in Delaware County, in the PA 5th District, right? So Mary Gay Scanlon is our member of Congress currently. And she's elected to represent most of Delaware County. And while she does have the interests of the country at heart, and while she is interested in doing what's good for Pennsylvania as a whole, her real interest is to represent the interests of Delaware County, and from our perspective, important to represent the interests of the city of Chester, where we are at. So those are balances. The president represents the entire country. Our senators represent the entire state that they're from. And our members of the House of Representatives balance that out by having more localistic interests that are more related to their smaller constituency. Nowadays, it's about 800,000 people in congressional districts. The other area of balance is this, terms of office. So what we see is that the House is supposed to be that body that's closest to the people, and they have 2-year terms, so they're up for re-election on a regular basis. Whereby the Senate is supposed to be a much more deliberative institution, and that has a 6-year term of office. So that in any given House election year, you'll have all 435 members of the House of Representatives up for re-election. We only have 1/3 of the U.S. Senate. Meaning that only 1/3 of the U.S. Senate is going to could have the potential to even turn over in every election cycle. We give the president a 4-year term for reasons that we'll talk about later, but they didn't want it to be so short that you wouldn't invest yourself in it, the office, 2 years, 1 year, whatever. And they also didn't want it to be so long that the president could run unmitigated with power for 6 years or so. We decided on 4 years. And then finally, the judiciary, as mentioned, has a lifetime term of office to keep them immune from politics. So balances is oftentimes left out of this conversation, but It's very important. It's important in the way that you manifest the various different interests of the country as a whole, the states as a whole, local governments as a whole, and also in the amount of time that we give each one of these individuals in office to be able to carry out what they do before they have to go up for re-election.